Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery, where today we're going to be taking a look at an enduring historical mystery. You've probably all heard of Edgar Allan Poe and his works. You've probably heard that he died under mysterious circumstances, just as I had. But do you know the actual story? It's just as dark and tragic as his writings. Of course, this video is sponsored by Magellan TV. As you probably know, we have an ongoing sponsorship, and I'm excited to let you know that Magellan is now offering a buy one get one free gift card for this Christmas season. Magellan is a streaming service dedicated purely to documentaries, and if you know someone who loves documentaries and education, then this could be a really fantastic Christmas present. If you go to my page, that'll be linked in the description, you'll see a banner to take advantage of this limited offer for my YouTube viewers, and buying a gift card at any time of the year will give you an extra month for free, even if you're already a member. And if you are already a member, here are my documentary recommendations for this month. Starting with Tessa Beachy, A Life Interrupted. Tessa was a drug mule caught trying to smuggle cocaine through Sao Paulo airport. But there's a huge plot twist when it's discovered that she was actually working on the instruction of the former wife of the state security minister. There are so many twists and turns here, I was enthralled by this documentary. And the second recommendation is Doctors Without Borders, Dedicated to Life, which is a 4-episode series following doctors who travel around the world and enter crisis zones to provide the best care they can to those who need it the most. It's just the most incredible, real people doing the best they can to help, and this documentary made me cry a number of times. I would highly recommend it. Magellan TV have everything from true crime to science, history, nature, and everything in between, with new programmes added weekly to be watched anywhere on your TV, laptop and mobile. It's compatible with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Google Play and iOS, and loads of the programmes are available in 4K. If you enjoy my channel, then honestly I cannot stress enough how much you'll enjoy Magellan TV. This is a perfect time to dedicate your time to educating yourself and learning something new. So Edgar Allan Poe was born just Edgar Poe on January 19th, 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts. His parents are both actors, Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins Poe and David Poe Jr. Elizabeth was significantly more successful in their field though, and together they had 3 children, Henry, Edgar and Rosalie. Tragedy and disappointment would be a running theme throughout Edgar's life. His first misfortune seemed to hit him when his father abandoned the family when Edgar was still very young. And then in 1811, Elizabeth would die of consumption, leaving the children with no caretaker. So the children were separated and raised by different families, with Edgar seemingly getting a good hand when he shipped off to John and Francis Allan in Richmond, Virginia. Hence the Allan in Edgar Allan Poe. Some sources describe John Allan as an uncle or a godfather of Edgar, or maybe even just a local family who didn't have children of their own, I'm not too sure. But Edgar is raised by the Allans with a happy childhood for the most part. He would travel to the UK with them, where John intended to expand his successful tobacco business, and he would attend different boarding schools in the UK in this time. It's said that it was in his time in the UK, with the old homes the family would live in, the castles, the moors and the folklore, that would inspire a lot of Edgar's later Gothic work. After the Allans' business venture in the UK essentially failed, they moved back to Richmond in 1820. And here he continues his studies, attending the University of Virginia in 1826 when he was around 17 years old. Also around this time, it's thought that he may have become engaged to a woman called Sarah Elmira Royster, or some sources say Elmira Sarah Royster, but either way. But all of that went pretty badly when he discovered that she actually ended up marrying another man whilst he was off at university. He studied Latin and French, but the year he spent there didn't go all that smoothly. John, whilst a very well-off man, refused to fund Edgar's time at university, and as a result, Edgar found himself in debt pretty quickly, which wasn't helped when he tried to turn to gambling to pay the debt off, only to incur more debt, as gambling tends to do. The two would constantly argue about the debt. Edgar thought John should pay it off, John didn't want to. It seems they may have had a pretty major falling out about this, as Edgar leaves Richmond pretty soon after and heads back to his birthplace of Boston. He hoped to pursue a literary career and actually published an anonymous book of poetry called Tamerlane and Other Poems in 1827. Apparently he was the first ever author to try and make a professional living as a writer and writer alone, but with his crippling debt, he decides to enlist in the US Army in 1927 for a 5-year term. He was assigned to Battery H of the 1st Artillery at Fort Independence in Boston Harbor before being ordered to Fort Moultrie. Then he works his way through the ranks to Sergeant Major, which is the highest possible rank he could achieve as a non-commissioned officer. And then he leaves the military service after just 2 years in April 1829, despite signing a 5-year contract. He is then given an appointment as a cadet at the US Military Academy in West Point, which again, he kinda hates. Edgar was just constantly restless, he was never happy settled in one place. One of his roommates said that he had the appearance of being much older. He had a worn, weary, discontented look, not easily forgotten by those who were intimate with him. And of course, it wasn't long until he just dropped out of the cadets. But this time John Allan wouldn't bail him out. Edgar just left and was eventually court-martialed for gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders. At this point, having fallen out with the Allans, he becomes reacquainted with his father's side of the family, who he'd never really met before. He moved to Baltimore to live with his aunt Maria Poe Clem and her daughter Virginia, and here he continues his writing, determined for it to lead somewhere. And eventually it does, when in 1833 he wins a $50 prize and significant attention for one of his short stories. He even gets a job offer as an editor for the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond off of the back of this, which he accepts and moves back to Richmond, and his aunt and cousin follow not long after. It was around this time in 1835 that Edgar realised that he'd fallen in love with his cousin Virginia, which is concerning on 2 counts. One, she was his cousin, which whilst gross now was acceptable in the 1800s, so I'll give him that one. But 2, she was 13 years old, maybe even younger. I suppose the same thing stands, gross and very paedophilic nowadays, acceptable in the 1800s, just about. Edgar was 27 years old to Virginia's 13, but they soon end up marrying. They must have known that the Virginia being 13 thing was a little bit dodgy, because they actually had to lie and say that Virginia was 21 for the marriage to even take place. Whilst working at the Southern Literary Messenger, Edgar publishes much of his own work in the newspaper, as well as many scathing reviews, which he gains a bit of a reputation for. He didn't care who he was criticising, he'd constantly criticise other authors, other writers, he was just fearless. Within the space of a year, he manages to make the Southern Literary Messenger one of the most popular magazines in the South. But he wasn't entirely happy with his low-paid job, and at the end of the day, he wanted to make his living from writing. So he moves to New York with Virginia and Aunt Clem in the hopes of kick-starting his career, and when that doesn't work, he moves to Philadelphia. In this time, he writes for a variety of magazines, and his name slowly becomes more recognised. He even releases a novel called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket in 1838. In spite of this though, you'd think releasing a novel is a pretty big thing, he's still struggling to make a living. Making a living from writing just wasn't a thing back then. Even from what I hear nowadays, I still don't think there's much money in writing unless you're one of the most famous writers. And then he releases his first book of short stories called Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, featuring the famous The Fall of the House of Usher. Considering how infamous this book went on to become, Edgar was paid just 25 copies of his own book in return for publishing it. He made no money, he just got copies of his own book. Over the next few years, he starts to fight for better wages for writers and attempts to start his own journal or magazine, but never quite manages to find the funding for it. He even attempted to secure a position within the administration of President John Tyler, but he ends up not turning up to a pretty important meeting pertaining to this and misses out entirely. He claimed that he was sick, but there were reasons to think that he was actually just drunk. It's around this time that it seems alcohol starts to become a real problem for Edgar, but he didn't have to drink loads to become drunk. It's thought that he may have actually had a genetic weakness when it came to alcohol, with reports saying that both him and his sister Rosalie could get completely drunk off of just one glass of wine. It really seemed to affect them. Edgar's life was just a constant battle of money and tragedy, which was only made worse in January 1842 when Virginia started to show the first signs of consumption. She would never get better, only slowly getting worse over the coming years, and Edgar would drink even more to cope with the stress. But he would also continue writing and even moved back to New York once again. 3 years later, he published his poem The Raven in the Evening Mirror, and he was instantly catapulted to fame, becoming a household name. Despite this, he again was paid very little money for it. There was just no money in writing. And scandal followed him wherever he went. After rumours of him having an affair with a married woman, him and Virginia have to move to the country where they lived together in a small cottage until she eventually passed away from her consumption at just the age of 24. Edgar was devastated. He'd lost the love of his life and struggled to write for a long time after. A lot of his critics said that he wouldn't live long without Virginia, and they weren't really wrong. He spent the next couple of years jumping from lover to lover, and then dies himself. He was just lost. In 1849, Edgar finally returns to Richmond and starts speaking to his ex-fiancée Elmira again. They were both now widows, and they lean on each other for support, getting engaged again soon after. They intended to marry once Edgar came back from a trip he had planned to Philadelphia and New York, where he was to edit a collection of poems from Mrs. St. Leon Loud, who was a minor but growing figure in American poetry. Only, of course, Edgar never returns from his trip. He got on the train to Philadelphia, but for reasons unknown, he made a stop in Baltimore on the way there, and nobody has a clue what happened to him over the course of the next 5 days. It was a rainy day on October 3rd, 1849, when an employee of the Baltimore Sun called Joseph W. Walker was on his way to Gunners Hall. Gunners Hall was usually a public house, but this was election day, so it was serving as a pop-up polling location. Before Joseph could go in to vote though, he found a man lying outside in the gutter. This man was dressed in shabby clothing. He was delirious, semi-conscious, unable to even move. As you can probably guess, this man was Edgar Allan Poe. Joseph asked Edgar, lying in the gutter, if he had any friends in Baltimore who might be able to help him. So Edgar gives him the name of Dr. Joseph E. Snodgrass, great name, a local magazine editor who had some medical knowledge. Joseph writes a letter right away for immediate attention. Dear Sir, there is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's 4th Ward polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress. He says he is acquainted with you. He is in need of immediate assistance. Snodgrass sends Edgar to Washington College Hospital, where he spends the next 4 days drifting in and out of consciousness. At no point was Edgar coherent long enough to explain how he ended up in the condition that he did, and he ended up dying on October 7th, 1849, when he was 40 years old. On the 4th night in hospital, the night before his death, he inexplicably started calling out the name Reynolds. Still, nobody knows who Reynolds was. And in the early hours of October 7th, he prayed, Lord, help my poor soul, before taking his last breath. His cause of death was noted as congestion of the brain, and no autopsy was ever done. He was buried 2 days later in a simple grave in Baltimore, and his fiancée wouldn't even know about his death until she read about it in the newspaper. Whilst we do have a cause of death for Edgar, the situation surrounding his death is still a mystery. How did he end up in the gutter so ill that he couldn't even move? It's worth noting that congestion of the brain used to be a common euphemism that doctors would use when explaining away deaths they thought to be caused by drugs or alcohol, which wasn't really societally acceptable. The general thought at the time was that Edgar's problem with drink had led to his downfall. The main thing that most people focus on with this case is Edgar's manner of dress when he was found. Edgar was known for being a pretty sharp dresser. Even though he couldn't always necessarily afford it, he always wore nice, well-fitting suits. He was found in the gutter wearing cheap, ill-fitting clothes that were totally unlike him. So much so that many people speculate that his own clothes may have actually been stolen from him and he had to just find other clothes to put on. This is probably the main question that people focus on when looking at this case. Edgar didn't even own clothes like the ones he was found wearing. So where on earth had he got them from? A very mysterious death does seem to fit with Edgar Allan Poe. The circumstances surrounding this could easily be taken out of the pages of one of his very own books. And with that, let's take a look at some common theories in this case. We'll start by looking at the alcohol-related theory, which is something I've already alluded to a couple of times here. As I mentioned earlier, it's very well documented that Edgar could not handle his alcohol, probably due to some kind of genetic predisposition. I can relate. I also get drunk off of just one glass of wine, but then again, I'm 5'1" and not much over 100 pounds. That makes sense. Edgar was a fully grown, probably at least average sized man. It's not quite as normal for him to be blind drunk after just one glass of wine, and then he would be violently ill for a number of days after. It's said that after just a couple of drinks, he would barely even be able to function, which doesn't bode well, as it does seem that he often turned to alcohol when times got hard, and Edgar Allan Poe had a lot of hard times. It seems that he knew he had a problem with alcohol as well, as in the months before his death he became a vocal member of the temperance movement. I talk about temperance in a lot more detail on my video on prohibition, which I'll link up here, but it was essentially a social movement in the USA that was against the consumption of alcohol, believing that alcohol only led to bad things. One biographer called Susan Archer Talley-Weiss also wrote in her biography of Poe that he had fallen ill in Richmond not long before his death. Apparently he'd seen a doctor who told him that if he had another attack, it would prove fatal. There's reason to think this first attack was alcohol related. Did he succumb to his weakness and have a drink, leading him down a black hole that led to his death? Or was his body just worn from years of alcohol abuse and a very low tolerance? People who knew Edgar thought that this was the most likely theory as well, with one close friend called J.P. Kennedy writing in the newspaper. On Tuesday last, Edgar A. Poe died in town here at the hospital from the effects of a debauch. He fell in with some companion here who seduced him to the bottle, which it was said he had renounced some time ago. The consequence was fever, delirium and madness, and in a few days a termination of his sad career in the hospital. Poor Poe, a bright but unsteady light has been awfully quenched. How J.P. Kennedy would have known the situation around his death, we do not know. Did he potentially see Edgar himself in Baltimore in the days beforehand, or was he just speculating like everyone else? We still don't know why Edgar ended up in Baltimore when he should have been in Philadelphia. Did something happen on the train on the way? Did he decide to go for a wander? Did he decide to meet a friend? We don't know. However, this theory may have actually been discredited back in the early 2000s. Back in the 1800s, it was a common practice for clippings of hair to be taken from people who had passed away, a memento mori to commemorate the dead. Eventually, this hair came to be in the possession of the Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore, who agreed to sacrifice some strands for heavy meta-analysis looking for answers. Apparently, you can tell quite a lot about somebody from analysis of a strand of hair, even when that hair is over 150 years old. Interestingly, the levels of arsenic in Edgar's hair was found to be 15 times the normal level for today, which I thought was incredibly interesting on first read. But it does turn out that was pretty normal for back in the 1800s. It's just likely that their water source had high levels of arsenic in, and it's very unlikely that this would have been the cause of his death because his body would have been used to those levels at the time. But what was telling was the level of lead found in his hair. It was shown that the amount of lead found had dropped 33% in the last couple of years of his life. The hair taken from his head would have shown a map of his life for at least 2 years. Just to illustrate what I mean with my own hair is crazy long. I've been growing this out for about 5 years, I think. This hair probably grew out my root about 5 years ago. This probably shows a completely different meta-analysis to what hair that's recently grown out of my head in the last 6 months would show. Your hair is a map of the last few years of your life. Edgar obviously had much shorter hair than me, so they could only really look at the last 2 years they estimated from his hair. Lead exposure back in Edgar's time would have most likely come from wine and or certain medications, and the fact that the lead dropped by 33% towards the end of his life showed that he likely hadn't been drinking for a while before his death. He was taking his temperance seriously. All of this indicates that Poe remained on the wagon until his death, but of course there's no way of knowing that for sure. But he was found collapsed and unable to move in a gutter. If not caused by alcohol, then what was it? Another popular theory is that he was beaten, obviously. One biographer called E. Oakes Smith wrote in her article Autobiographic Notes, Edgar Allan Poe, that apparently he was beaten at the instigation of a woman who considered herself injured by him. He was cruelly beaten, blow upon blow, by a ruffian who knew of no better mode of avenging supposed injuries. He suffered brain damage from this beating. Perhaps the cause of death was a mixture of both theories here. Perhaps he did run into some friends who he joined for a single drink, thinking it would do no harm, but he got drunk, got himself into a sticky situation with a woman, and ended up being beaten. For me though, neither of these theories quite explain the weird shabby clothing. But what could explain it is the next theory of cooping, which was a common method of voter fraud back then. Gangs would kidnap a man, seeing as women were not allowed to vote, and force him to dress up in disguises and vote multiple times for a specific person. This was apparently quite popular in Baltimore at the time, and Edgar was found outside a polling location. Also, interestingly, voters were given alcohol after voting as a kind of incentive and thank you. If Edgar had been forced to vote multiple times and had a cup of alcohol each time, then that could explain the situation he found himself in. Maybe the gang even beat him a little bit just to top things off. Or in a complete 180, in 1996 it was speculated that maybe Edgar had rabies. In his time in the hospital he was comatose for the most part, but would occasionally awaken, hallucinating and perspiring heavily. He would be confused, he would drift in and out of sleep. He was reluctant to even drink water, suffering with hydrophobia. Apparently, he had all the hallmarks of rabies. You often think of rabies as crazy frothing at the mouth, but that's not the case most of the time. It's just an illness. Rabies is given to a human by the bite of a rabid animal, and the illness can take up to a year to set in. Edgar could have been bitten 9 months beforehand and thought nothing of it at all until he starts to get ill in Baltimore. A lot of doctors who study rabies are sure that Edgar had all of the hallmarks. In 1996, a researcher called Dr. Benitez was assigned a case study as part of a clinical pathologic conference, where he was presented a hypothetical patient and a description of symptoms, having to give a diagnosis. His patient was described only as EP, a writer from Richmond, but he soon put 2 and 2 together. From what I can gather, the case studies were based on real-life patients. But it is unlikely to have actually been Edgar, as any documentation relating to his death, including his death certificate, have since been lost. Or perhaps he had a brain tumour, which could account for a lot of his strange behaviour. When he died, he was buried in a simple grave in Baltimore graveyard, and it wasn't until 26 years later that he was given something more ceremonious, with a statue being erected in his honour near the entrance of the graveyard. His remains were dug up in order to be moved to this new spot of honour, but his coffin was rotted and just disintegrated in the workers' hands. Of course, Edgar was fully decomposed by this point, with only his skeleton remaining, but one worker noticed something strange. There was a mass rolling around inside of Edgar's skull. Newspapers at the time said that this mass was Edgar's brain, but we know better than that nowadays. The brain is actually one of the first things that decomposes with all of that soft tissue, but a tumour can calcify after death into a hard mass. Was this the cause of everything? Had they finally found the answer? It is also rumoured that a doctor once told Edgar that the reason he had such adverse reactions to alcohol is because he had lesions on his brain, which very much makes sense. To me, this could also explain the strange clothes that Edgar was found wearing. If this tumour finally started to have an effect on his everyday life, perhaps he stopped caring so much about his clothes. Perhaps he misplaced his and had to go and buy new ones for cheap. I think this is probably my favourite theory of the lot. To me, this explains a lot of the things. But of course, this wouldn't be a true crime video if it didn't mention the possibility of murder. And it has long been speculated that Edgar was actually murdered by his brothers-in-laws-to-be, who didn't want him marrying Elmira. I couldn't find any reason as to why they didn't want this, but Edgar probably had a bit of a reputation, and they probably didn't want their sister marrying somebody who was just a struggling writer and had no money. The author of Midnight Dreary, The Mysterious Death of Edgar Allan Poe, John Evangelist Walsh, writes that Edgar apparently did make it to Philadelphia, but he wasn't there for long when he was ambushed by the brothers. He disguises himself in new clothes and begins the journey back to Richmond, only to get intercepted again in Baltimore and is beaten so bad that he ends up dying. It seems like most people think this is rubbish though, with very little basis in truth, so we can kind of discount this theory as a whole, but I couldn't not speculate murder. Maybe it was murder just by somebody else entirely. Maybe someone thought Edgar looked rich in his suit and stole it along with the rest of his belongings. How you get a grown man to take off his suit, I don't really know. It's all speculation. All in all, we're never really going to know what exactly happened. Perhaps if we knew why Edgar ended up in Baltimore in the first place, we might have more answers, but it's unlikely we're going to get them coming up to 200 years later. If I had to place a bet, I'd say brain tumour mixed with his inability to handle alcohol, but that's just a guess. Of course, it could have been literally any other illness as well. Maybe he just had the flu or meningitis or cholera or anything else, but none of that really accounts for the suit in my eyes. Or maybe he just fancied wearing a bad suit that day. Maybe he was just having an off day and he just happened to die. Nowadays, a lot of people talk about how Edgar Allan Poe was a drunken womanizer of a man, how he had no morals, he was a bit insane, but that isn't really true as to how he was in life. The truth is that Edgar Allan Poe pissed off a lot of people with his scathing reviews in the magazines, and he had quite a few enemies in the writing world. After his death, a literary rival of his called Rufus Griswold wrote a memoir about Edgar, in which he painted a not so nice picture of him, and that legend just kind of stuck over the years. Rufus literally attempted to ruin Edgar's reputation immediately after his death, but this did actually help push Edgar's books and poetry sales after his death, and it probably is one of the reasons why his name is still so well known today. But Poe was likely not an immoral, unstable drunk. Edgar Allan Poe was known for his gothic fiction. He constantly questioned death in his works. It only seems right that his own death would also be questioned. But he also wrote satires and very occasionally comedy. He's been credited with creating two popular genres that we see everywhere nowadays: science fiction and the classic detective story. Would my career even exist or be as popular as it is if it wasn't for Edgar Allan Poe? Hence the reason why history fascinates me so much. All of these millions of people throughout history having tiny little effects on each of our lives in ways we'll never even realise. Please let me know in the comments down below which you think is the most likely theory here, or do you know of any other theories in his death that I maybe didn't mention in this video? Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!